At this point, we've talked a little bit about the nature of energy and how it flows through the biosphere. And we are going to continue that conversation about energy. But before we do, we need to take a pause and talk a little bit more about the details around a major metabolic process that occur in living organisms that mediate energy conversions. The first of these processes is photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the process by which organisms capture and store light energy, utilizing it to power cellular processes. The word photosynthesis literally means to make with light, photo means light, and synthesis means to make. And specifically, what photosynthesis makes is carbohydrates. How does this work? How do photoautotrophs take the kinetic energy of light and capture it into something tangible like a carbohydrate? We're not going to go into great detail here because that's beyond the scope of what we need to know for this class. So instead, we're going to give a broad overview of the steps involved in photosynthesis. When solar energy is absorbed by a photoautotrophic organism, the solar energy breaks the chemical bonds in water molecules, which are freely available in the cell. And by breaking the bonds, the electrons in those bonds can be extracted. Naturally, the result of breaking the bonds between the atoms in a molecule of water, H2O, is that you get the separate constituents parts. Hydrogen ions because they're missing some electrons, and pure oxygen gas. The oxygen gas gets released into the environment. It's considered a waste product by this process. Meanwhile, carbon dioxide is going the opposite direction. It's being absorbed from the environment. And the hydrogen ions and energy of the electrons that were generated in previous steps are used to take those carbon dioxide molecules that are absorbed and create carbohydrates. The common carbohydrate that comes out of this process is called glucose, and it's a molecule consisting of 6 carbon atoms, 12 hydrogen atoms, and 2 oxygen atoms, or in other words, C6H12O6. In its simple numbering system, that would be CH2O if we divide by 6, or hydrated carbon, HCH2O. So that's a summary of how this process works. But an even more um, uh, uh, complete summary of photosynthesis can be represented in the form of a chemical reaction that shows the inputs for the process on the left-hand side and the outputs on the right-hand side. Carbon dioxide and water get used up, with the water being the giver of electrons, the thing being oxidized, and the carbon dioxide being the ultimate recipient, the thing being reduced. The result is that the carbohydrate glucose is created and oxygen gas is generated and released into the environment. So this is how photoautotrophs self-feed. This is how they create their own food, their own carbohydrates. But how can energy be extracted from this food? This is where the second metabolic process comes in. And this one is performed by both autotrophs to extract the energy from the food that they create, as well as by heterotrophs to extract energy from the organic matter they consume when they eat other organisms. And that process is called cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is more or less the exact reverse of photosynthesis. It extracts the chemical energy stored in the carbohydrate molecule made through photosynthesis and converts it into kinetic energy that can be used for cellular processes. So in this diagram, the inputs of the process are seen on the right and the outputs are on the left. Cellular respiration oxidizes glucose, meaning that it extracts its electrons and transfers them to molecules of oxygen gas. Oxygen gas is absorbed from the atmosphere, and for animals like ourselves, this is done every time we take a breath. When all of the usable electrons have been extracted from the carbohydrate and placed upon oxygen, and all of the kinetic energy pulled out of the glucose molecule, what you're left with is molecules of water and carbon dioxide, the latter of which, carbon dioxide, is put back out into the atmosphere. So as you can see, cellular respiration is the exact reverse of photosynthesis in terms of what it consumes and what it generates. But cellular respiration is not the only process that heterotrophs may conduct to extract energy from carbohydrates. Sometimes cellular respiration is not possible, and there are a few reasons why this might be the case. One is that there might not be enough oxygen available. Oxygen is a necessary ingredient for cellular respiration, and without it, the process cannot take place. For example, if an animal is sprinting very hard for a long distance trying to escape a predator, it's breathing heavily, taking in as much oxygen as possible. But that still might not be enough oxygen to facilitate the enormous energy burning event that is occurring in its cells. The cells still need energy, but they need an alternative process to extract it. Another example might be a species of bacteria that lives in a deep sea ocean habitat where there is almost no oxygen available. In fact, there is a significant number of microscopic organisms that simply aren't genetically equipped to perform cellular respiration. They don't have instructions in their DNA for those processes. So, in cases such as these, what is a heterotroph to do? Well, there are a couple of alternatives to cellular respiration that are available to certain heterotrophs. One of them is called anaerobic respiration. In anaerobic respiration, a different molecule is substituted for the role of oxygen, and the process works largely as it would if oxygen was there. This other molecule can be several things, including nitrates, sulfur, sulfate, or others. The other possibility is a process called fermentation. Fermentation only partially breaks down the glucose molecule, and therefore less kinetic energy is extracted. But cells are able to get this particular partial breakdown done without the need for oxygen. Fermentation also generates different byproducts depending on the organism. When human cells perform fermentation, the product is lactic acid. Um, but in microorganisms, it can be an extremely wide range of different molecules depending on the species. Okay, so we now understand how photosynthesis and cellular respiration work. Why does it matter? Why? What is the greater significance of these processes in the environment and in the biosphere? Well, in the case of photosynthesis, there are three big roles that it plays in the environment. One is oxygen production. Photosynthesis is responsible for oxygenating the Earth's atmosphere and bodies of water. And without it, the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere would be negligible. The next is energy production. This one we have already described. Photosynthesis is the gateway through which new energy enters the Earth as a system. In nearly every ecosystem, all of the energy can be traced back to the sun via photosynthesis. Thirdly is carbon fixation, which is another way of saying that photosynthesis captures carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and transforms it into organic materials, namely carbohydrates, but other molecules as well. This provides the source of raw material that makes up living organisms, but it also draws carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which mitigates the greenhouse effects of and moderates the Earth's climate. Cellular respiration, too, is important in a holistic sense when looking at the Earth as a system. Cellular respiration allows the chemical energy that is built up through photosynthesis to be released and to drive all of the complex functions that support the livelihood in living organisms. In addition, cellular respiration has a very direct interplay with photosynthesis, given that the two processes are the exact reverse of one another. Cellular respiration recycles and regenerates the raw materials that are needed for photosynthesis and also keeps the products of photosynthesis in balance. There's actually evidence in the geologic history of the Earth as to what happens when cellular respiration and photosynthesis aren't balancing each other. The Carboniferous period was a 60 million year span during the Paleozoic era when woody land plants evolved and proliferated across the terrestrial surfaces of the Earth. With this land plant proliferation, there was a lot more photosynthesis going on, and therefore a lot more oxygen being generated, which you can see reflected in the spike in the figure, corresponding to the Carboniferous period. At the same time, there was not a corresponding spike in cellular respiration. Animals, fungi, and bacteria were not breaking down the organic matter at the same rate that photosynthesis was creating it, which is why the oxygen levels of the atmosphere shot up, shown in blue, but the carbon dioxide levels, shown in black, dropped down. Eventually, conditions changed and cellular respiration came back into balance with photosynthesis. But this Carboniferous period is actually responsible for the coal deposits and some oil deposits that we rely on today for fuel. You may remember from chapter 1 that we defined fossil fuels as materials coming from the remnants of ancient dead organisms. That's what happened in the Carboniferous period. Plants grew in abundance, they died in abundance, and nothing was breaking them down after they died. So their bodies became buried in deposits and fossilized. Now we dig them up and extract them for fuel. So even in this sense, the energy found in the fossil fuels that we use today traces back to the sun. It's just that the photosynthesis that created that energy took place millions of years ago, but it is still, nonetheless, very old sunlight energy.